Cool. So, as I said, this is the first time in 13 years that I am having to read off a script, simply because I wrote this last night, and with zero help of ChatGPT. Honestly, no. I just sat down. This was, and I just started typing. I just wanted to talk about the things which are very present in my mind at the moment, and that's just AI and governance and Bitcoin, really. That's the overriding thing that sort of drives my thinking. And I just sort of started typing. Really, it should be another chapter in the book. But we basically have a problem, and humanity faces a looming crisis which isn't killer robots, it's not Terminator, but a subtler, more insidious threat, which is centralized AI controlled by the few, amplifying the flaws of broken systems of the past. History shows us that what happens when power concentrates and incentives misalign, things break. And when flawed economics thrive and weak money is prevalent, disaster is the terminal outcome. But society is myopic. Just like the health industry focuses on treating the symptoms and not the causes, society is forever battling the symptoms of a terminally doomed system. We see this in every area of life because poor governance always leads to currency debasement. And the moment that happens, it kicks off many parallel tumbling dominoes. Anyway, so I've written 2 books now. Like in the crypto book in 2017, I went through this in detail. I covered it. Who has not got a copy of my book, by the way? The new one. Okay, we've got a few spare kicking at the back, and I've got some in my room as well, so I'll make sure to bring them all out in the break. But please take one for free, because I have done this to death. But the logical process that I have said in many trading pubs over time is this. And a lot of it isn't sequential, a lot of it happens in parallel, but basically currency dilution always leads to asset price inflation. This is why, as crypto bag holders, we can't wait till Jerome Powell starts cutting rates and printing. But what that does is it makes consumer prices explode. You know, we're going through this cost of living crisis at the moment, and everyone's like, oh, things are so expensive. Well, why do you think that happened? We printed $5 trillion out of our arse, and it goes somewhere, doesn't it? It always percolates through stocks, bonds, commodities, and real estate, but eventually, after about a couple of years, that $5 trillion is in everything, and that's why prices of everything blows up. And then we have shrinkflation and cost cutting. You know, chocolate bars are continually getting smaller. Packets of crisps that feel so big, you open them, they're like a quarter full. I have to have party-sized bags of crisps these days, like just a single helping. Yeah, I don't have to, but I choose to. And so not only is our purchasing power reducing, the shit that we buy is also shrinking, and the quality is getting worse. So we have eroding real wealth and purchasing power, which then leads to wealth inequality. Also in parallel, we have house prices going crazy, which means unaffordability for a large segment of the population. I would say on a standard distribution of the population, everyone within 2 sigma is struggling to buy a house. So that's 95% of the population, which means we then have increased rents. I mean, I'm in a shitty Airbnb right now. It's tiny. I'm paying £3,900 a month for this teeny weeny Airbnb. If only my wife listened to me 6 months ago about, yeah, anyway. So we're not only are we seeing shitty Airbnbs getting really expensive, but just normal rents. If you go to Rightmove right now and look at just normal rental properties in the Norwich area, where I'm from, like it's just all HMOs. And HMOs in itself is just racked up rents. And so there's like nothing to rent in Norfolk, really. And then ultimately that leads to increased homelessness. And then again, all in parallel, more unemployment, which means we have economic stagnation. And when you look at GDP, there's lots of variables, but you can break it down into simple terms. GDP is effectively the amount of workers in a nation, how many hours a year do they work, and what is the average GDP per person. There's really only 3 variables to the GDP equation. That's my take on this. And so when you have a population where we're all struggling to live, we're working less, and we're spending a larger percentage of our income on stuff, we have less capital or money to work properly, and therefore we have economic stagnation. And then eventually, when people are up shit's creek, we form bad habits. A lot of people, they seek refuge in gambling or alcohol or drugs or just destructive habits, full stop. I choose gaming, but yeah. And unfortunately, those bad habits form they ferment into physical and mental health crises eventually. And everyone's individual, of course, and then we all have different coping mechanisms. But another thing which sort of is a tag-along to this is declining fertility and birth rates. There's a whole chapter of this in my book about non-procreating humans, which is my new term for people that don't push out babies anymore. But that's a global trend, by the way. And the amount of people not pushing babies out anymore is, that's because everyone is poorer in a general sense. We do have real fertility rates tumbling, and we have an existential crisis, a humanitarian existential crisis. And again, it's one of the last chapters in the book. A lot of people think that the Earth is going to be overcrowded. It's not. Yes, we're still on the up phase, but it's a parabola. It's going to be coming down at some point. And I believe South Korea has now overtaken Japan to be the first nation to become extinct in about 100 or so years. Their human replacement rate is the lowest on the planet right now. And to put that into perspective, Japan is losing about 1.2 million people per year. 1.2 million people per year. There's some villages with no schools because they've got like 2 or 3 kids. Not good. Oh, and when you see that, what do you think that does to economic or prosperity? It's minimizing GDP to a degree. You also have more single-parent families, and it's interesting. I've watched a fair few Joe Rogan interviews about the relationship between. This is a US stat, but when you have a massive increase of single-parent families, it leads to more crime and overpopulated prisons. I think the relationship between a prisoner or someone that's gone to jail and single-parent families is like a very high correlation. So it's the decimation of the nuclear family over time, and what this leads to is societal ideological divides. Like we're now 2025, and I could just say a few random words, and I could split you guys down the middle. Trump, COVID, jabs, all that sort of stuff. Like, pick a random topic. Half of you are going to vehemently disagree or agree. Transgender, I don't know, that's another divisive thing. So what's happening is that society is becoming more fragile. And a fragile society, a society that can't tell the difference between a boy and a girl, is not good. Sorry, again, I'm just pissing half of you off at the moment. I will piss off all of you at some point today, so I'm an equal offender. And again, this leads to more hate crime, more crimes, more violence, which means we then have increased radicalization. We're seeing this in the UK, even more so. Like in the last couple of months, this topic is a big one towards a certain demographic. And ultimately, a population can only take so much, and then something good happens. Typically, revolutions and regime changes I look at them with a fond perspective. That's probably the inner anarchist in me. But if you were to look at all revolutions and regime changes of the past in any world, or any country, sorry, they are typically for good reasons. It's because they've had an oppressing government, an autocratic dictator who's been nasty and mean, and eventually the people get pissed off. And then they vote with their feet and fists. So Not all the time, obviously. Sometimes revolutions are bad. But what this means is that you end up with desperate governments, like really desperate governments. And what do desperate governments do? You then have a big breakdown in the amount of political parties that, like we all think, take the UK, we've got like Labour and the Tories, right? We think there's two, we think we've got choices. You vote Labour, you vote Tories, or you vote Reform, or whatever. In reality, it's just one party. No matter who gets in power, you end up with the same shit because the government is not in control. And so, desperate governance means more centralized control. We saw earlier this morning what Spain are trying to do with capital controls. More centralized controls means more currency dilution because one of the ways they do to print their way out of shit is print. Just print. And I've talked about the Cantillon effect endlessly. And it also means bigger, bloated governments and therefore more Big Brother. Again, Spain with their new capital controls. We saw this in Cyprus. We see this everywhere. And what does Big Brother do? It makes people like me really pissed off, which then leads to more crime, more overpopulated prisons, more society, more divides. It's this loop which continues to start flywheeling, and it gets faster and faster until we have that revolution. And so when you look at desperate governments, what happens is they become a cesspit of leeches. And with these leeches, such as big pharma, big food, big military industrial complex, big media, and big intelligence. All of these conglomerates, these single-tracked entities, they dictate government policy. There's all sorts of political lobbying that happens behind the scenes. And what happens is that they suckle off of the teat of the government. And that teat is the printer. And at every stage of this societal unwinding, like government gets bigger, and in order to get re-elected or to appease people, and just temporarily plaster issues, they cut rates and print more money. It really is as simple as that. Investing in 2010s onwards has become as simple as that. Just position yourself accordingly into the assets that pump when rates are cut and the printer goes brrr. And it just exacerbates this whole domino train. And big unelected NGO think tanks that direct global policies from top down, they force whatever profitable narrative for them down our throats. The world is obsessed with climate change and ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Who created ESG? BlackRock. BlackRock created ESG. They force it down the World Economic Forum, and then from the World Economic Forum, it's forced down into all countries. A lot of the things that are happening in every country, they found that ideation origin is from the World Economic Forum. So, big NGOs, and thankfully, Doge in the US, USAID was literally the secret money printer for these NGOs, and thankfully Elon found that. Eventually the societal train does derail, and that's when shit gets real. It gets really interesting from a trader's perspective. So, a story which I learned probably 15 years ago has stuck with me. And whenever I think of currency expansion, I always think of this Scottish chap called John Law. Have you ever heard me talk about John Law before? I haven't mentioned him for a while. So John Law absolutely fascinates me because they should make a movie out of him. So basically, he's one of the, in 1694, he was a 23-year-old Scottish gambler who killed a man in a duel over a romantic dispute. And he was jailed and sentenced to death. This was in 1694, 23 years old. He fled and escaped, and he fled to Amsterdam, where he made a name for himself as a financier. In 1715, France had a large economic crisis from wars and overspending. just like every government does, always. And with no money and staggering debt, and no solutions from his advisors, Philippe, who was the regent of France back then, Philippe II, he was looking for help and solutions because his advisors had no solutions. So, John arrived in France. By this time, he'd set up like an elite group of friends around the gambling. He was a gambler, of course, so he made a lot of money, had a lot of influential friends, and he made his way over to Paris. And he basically managed to orchestrate a meeting with Philippe in one of these high elite circles, these private gents clubs or whatever. And he made such an impression that Philippe basically got him on board to help, because John had these brand new game-changing economic ideas of how to basically get a country out of Dodge, which is print more currency. By the way, back then that was a really novel idea. So yeah, and due to his conviction and confidence, he became a very close advisor to Philippe. So his solution is that John set up a private bank, which was then later nationalized 1 year later, and he was issued authority from Philippe to print paper money, backed by land and gold. Now, John's company and private bank supposedly had lots of links to French Louisiana, which had hundreds of thousands of acres of land in the States. So he was using this land as collateral to just print French currency. And basically, yeah, it's called the Mississippi Company. And he became the treasury manager of the whole of France, like within a couple of years. So the printing press went nuts, and this led to rampant speculation and price rocketing. His company, in the Mississippi Company, the share price sparked a stock market rally across the whole country, and money just poured in. Not just money that sat in the sidelines in France, but everywhere in Europe. Everyone wanted a piece of the French action, especially John Law and his Mississippi Company. And he made all of his friends filthily rich, including Philippe. And he was this whiz kid, this economic whiz kid that just got a country out of the gutter into, a booming nation, because money printing or currency printing was this brand new invention back then, to a degree. So him being really rich, he bought as many things as he could, as much land, as jewelry, gold, everything. But all bubbles burst, and in 1720, that bubble did burst, and there was rampant inflation everywhere. Remember, there's normally a couple of years before currency printing leads to rampant inflation. And everyone got wiped out. It plunged France back into an economic recession way worse than Philippe was in before he met John Law. So, yeah, bubble burst, and guess what? He was exiled from Europe. So Philippe was that unhappy, he kicked him out of France, and he just bumbled from country to country and then died 9 years later. He lost everything. And that is an amazing, that could be a great movie. And in more recent times, we've seen like prime examples of this happen in Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Argentina. You print more currency, stuff happens. Normally not good stuff. But politicians they never learn from their mistakes. And because a politician's only in power for 4 years, they don't give a shit. So, it's not just the quality of money that's at fault. You can have perfect money. You can have Bitcoin as your pure monetary system, and things will still go wrong. Because it's all about governance and government. If you have a bad governance and bad government, it's irrelevant of what your currency system is. Things will go wrong because it's the government that chooses to debase a currency. Even if right now we had Bitcoin as our sole current monetary system, all it would take is one chap or lady in power who wasn't happy and then just disbands it. So, I've always been a Bitcoin maxi, but you need governance as well as money. So Bitcoin and good governance is the thing that we need to do, but it's something that humans are unlikely to ever achieve. And the reason the markets are so cyclical is because humans never change. It's our human nature that never changes. And so when you get a consolidation of power, that power, power corrupts absolutely. So when you look at humans on a timeline, and when I say humans, let's say Homo sapiens, relatively modern Homo sapiens. So if you were to draw that timeline, human civilizations have emerged roughly 10,000 years ago. Okay, I know Homo sapiens have been around for roughly 250,000 years, but modern human civilization, they use Göbekli Tepe in Turkey as the day zero. So we've got 10,000 years of, let's say, of governance history, and throughout all that time, it's been an autocratic system, pretty much throughout all of modern human history. Democracy is a relatively new invention, and what we have at the moment is a very poor version of democracy. A lot of people look at the world right now and go, democracy doesn't work, let's do communism, which definitely doesn't work. But we've never had true democracy. We've had crony capitalism and crony democracy. So that is the distinction here. And there's many different forms of democracy that we can do. So this leads us to a real-world case study, a very recent one, which we've all heard about, but I think it's a little bit out of our it's a bit too recent. Schools don't really cover it, and that's the Berlin Wall crisis. Okay, so I didn't learn this at school, I just had to learn this on my own. But basically, after the fall of World War II, Berlin was split up into the communist side and the capitalist Western side. And so this was like the perfect petri dish for economic experimentation. And so basically, so this was between the 1960s and 1980s with the Berlin Wall. So we have one city with two identical currencies to begin with, and two completely contrasting forms of government. What an experiment. So West and East, they had different names, but just for ease of this presentation, I'm going to call them West Deutschmark and East Deutschmark. The East one's technically called the GDR. But they both start off as one-to-one. But due to Soviet governance, remember governance is the key here, Soviet governance, there was zero Eastern Deutschmark demand on the international scene, as it was non-convertible outside the Soviet bloc, and thus no value in Western markets. In reality, the Western Deutschmark was worth 10 Eastern Deutschmarks very quickly. So prosperity in East Berlin quickly began to fall due to a dying currency and terrible GDP, as it couldn't openly trade internationally. People wanted to escape their dying currency, of course, so there were strict capital controls, Spain, more recently. And to stem the economic energy fleeing to the West, they had not just capital controls, but people controls, as in they really enforced that wall. The eastern side of the Berlin Wall was heavily militarized compared to no one was going from the west to the east, basically. And this always confuses me. When you look at, has anyone looked at the Great Wall of China before? Have you seen which direction the defensive barricades are facing? This is going to be a little rabbit hole for you. The defensive part of the wall is facing into China. I've always found that weird. It's like someone walled China across just to stop them from coming out. It's really weird. I always think, did the Chinese really build that wall? Because it's literally that's always been a little bugbear of mine. Next time you look at the Chinese wall, the Great Wall of China, just look at all of the defensive portholes and whatnot. It's facing China, not the other way around. Where was I? So poor governance meant overproduction of state-mandated products. Remember, the Soviet Union back then was all about industry. So they massively overproduced on military equipment and stuff like that because it was a Cold War. But it meant underproduction of the stuff that humans actually wanted, groceries, everyday living stuff. And so quality of life massively faltered. So prices for everything, literally everything, had to be heavily subsidized by the Soviet state because they just weren't focusing on production. And everything was centrally planned, i.e. some jobs worth in the government would go, right, the prices of bread today are, yeah, whatever. And so they would centrally mandate everything. And as such, there were multi-hour queues for almost every product, from milk to eggs to bread. And people used to just queue up not knowing what they were queuing for, knowing that if there was a queue, it's something that they would most likely definitely need. And of course, this is a gross waste of time, because if you're standing in queue, what are you not doing? You're not working. So GDP is not good. And post-Berlin Wall, Soviet officials were shocked at how West Berlin never had any queues for pretty much anything, and that there were dozens of shops all selling the same things. In one area, you'd have lots of bakeries, and therefore prices would be competitive because all these bakery shops would all be competing against each other. And then the market could just shop wherever they wanted. This really puzzled the Soviet economists back in the day. But yeah, so in West Berlin, the free market was in buoyant display. In the East, living conditions were terrible. It basically remained a shell-shocked post-World War II city. Less than 50% owned a car, and those that had ordered one were on 10 to 15-year waiting lists. And although housing and healthcare was free, it was incredibly suboptimal. So there we were, another recent example of a living experiment where bad money and bad government has given us identical answers to history. This is not the first nor the last time that this will happen. And this leads us to this little story. And late last night, I was just, okay, the only thing I have used ChatGPT for is to create these little pictures, okay? So I'm about to tell you a story. And these story, all I've got for slides are just pictures. So, yeah, the thing is, we have bad money, bad governance, and we now have this added accelerant, which no one is really planning for. And that's AI. AI is this gasoline which will just make everything worse or everything better. And I think it's a very, very slim chance that it gets better. Sorry, this is not a pleasant, uplifting presentation, by the way. So, in a nearish future, there is a cataclysmic event, and it's forced humanity into leaving Earth. And there are two big spaceships going to a star system with two habitable planets within that system's Goldilocks zone. And in order to improve the odds of humanity lasting, it was decided that one ship would go to Centria, and another ship would go to decentria. But these ships weren't filled with the same types of people. The Centrians ship were a bunch of elites and politicians and rich people, and the decentrians were basically what was left of everyone else that didn't die. So we had two Noah's Arks all going to two different planets. Both planets, thankfully, learned from the mistakes of the past when it came to hard money, and both adopted Bitcoin as their monetary system. Bitcoin is pure. Bitcoin is raw energy. It is amazing. We all know this. And they all believed that this would protect them of the horrors of the past. But where they differed were the paths of AI development. So on Centria, they appointed a president called Altman. Not Altman, Altman. There's a U there, just so you know, before I get sued. So yeah, they appointed a brand new president called Altman, a successful billionaire who was an AI leader. And very quickly, the Centrians fell back to their old ways. Companies popped up like weeds, AI was the hottest thing in town, and everyone was racing to develop the best models in every niche. Naturally, many of the elites had cozied up to government to win big contracts, and crony capitalism was back in force. They all had this false feeling of a safety blanket that just because they're using Bitcoin now, nothing bad could ever happen again. The future would be 100% bright and prosperous because Bitcoin is the savior. So there was no second thought on how bad business would become a cancer to Centria, just like it had on Earth. But old habits die hard. Over time, oh shit. No one saw that. Over time, Altman grew accustomed to being the president, constantly getting backhanders and letting his friends dominate the AI scene. Because profit was their North Star, Centria's stock and capital markets only seemed to care about AI development that would lead to profits. Some of the longer tail AI developments that didn't have obvious or immediate revenue use cases or revenue models were shunned. And before you could blink, pretty much all of the coding and dev talent was hired by one of the big AI mega conglomerates. Thankfully, Bitcoin did act as a bit of a backstop. They couldn't inflate the currency like they used to in the past. It kept government borrowing and spending in check. But over time, the Centrian government found that Bitcoin was too restrictive of a monetary system. It was hindering Altman's power, so to speak. It was slowing down growth, and growth and GDP and profit was the North Star of the Centrians. So Altman did the one thing that he really shouldn't have done. In a future-destroying press conference, he announced that the planet of Centria would be unbinding the restrictive growth handcuffs of Bitcoin and instead launching a new central bank digital currency backed by Bitcoin. Not 1 for 1, but 10 for 1. So 10 Centrian dollars would now be backed by $1 worth of Bitcoin. I'm making this up as I go along, obviously. In a matter of minutes, Altman had flung the Centrians back into a fractional reserve banking system with little regard for what happens 100% of the time as a result of this. Within a year, the global stock market was roaring, asset prices were spiraling, and centuries of issues were now awaking. Then there was a natural disaster. Combined with a looming re-election, Altman wanted to ingrain his position as the head of Centria. So he did what any optics-aware politician has done for centuries. He printed more dollars into existence from thin air in order to pay for the disaster cleanup and aid and to win the re-election, which he did. All was great in Centria, but we all know their terminal path. But what ever happened to Decentria? Similarly, they had very, very similar days to Centria. And it's almost a similar story, except there was a fork in the road. An unassuming young man called Jacob was trusted and thrusted into power as president of Decentria. But he didn't like this power. He didn't believe one person could wield such power and that human nature is by design flawed. Thankfully, Jacob was a gamer and a critical thinker. So he quickly addressed the world and said that he would accept this position on a temporary basis whilst he worked on a better system. And with the help of other talented people, they quickly created an AI. This wasn't that hard. This was a governance AI. And it was easy to let it know what was good and evil, what was right and wrong, basic laws, and that it would be an AI president. So think of a decentralized autonomous organization based on facts, curiosity, and fairness, impervious to corporate gluttony. They named their new AI president Yuma, and life was great. Crony capitalism literally couldn't get a foothold anywhere as Yuma was transparent and therefore made all markets transparent and based on merit. But this was just the start for Decentria. Like on Centria, AI in general was booming, and so Jacob and Yuma brainstormed what the perfect AI would look like. An AI that wouldn't kill humanity, but help it. And an AI that wasn't beholden or controlled by the few. So what makes a perfect AI? It needs to be accessible. Anyone, anywhere can use it or contribute to it with no barriers. It needs to be collaborative. Knowledge and improvements are shared openly, so everyone builds on top of each other's work. This way, huge chunks of researchers and research time wouldn't be wasted all on focusing on the same problem but behind closed doors for IP fears. It needs to be merit-based. The best ideas rise through fair competition, not corporate clout. It needs to be diverse. It needs to tackle all kinds of problems, big and small, not just the profitable ones. It needs to be transparent. You can trust it because its workings are open and verifiable, not the trust me bro. It needs to be scalable. It needs to grow to meet new challenges without breaking. And it needs to be distributed and decentralized, harnessing the power of the network effects and increasing resilience and performance whilst reducing costs. Last but not least, it needs to be censorship resistant. No one can control or shut it down. No government nor corporation will be able to control it. With all of these positive traits, everyone would own this new AI or network of AIs. Tensor was born. The people of Decentria loved this idea, and they loved how fair Tensor was. And the next day, a distributed and decentralized network of smaller AIs and AI startups that all focused on any and every niche. Growth was electric as everyone cross-pollinated products and services. If someone needed compute power, they got it on demand and cheaper from spare compute on the network, much cheaper than had it been done by a centralized company, centralized for-profit company. If someone wanted file storage, again, there was decentralized file storage AI that facilitated it. Again, much cheaper than if a centralized for-profit entity was providing the service. This truly was a Cambrian explosion of innovation in every niche and field of science. Again, not just the profitable areas. Prices for everything plummeted to gross marginal cost. Services improved exponentially. Affordability of anything increased exponentially. Everyone could afford everything. Productivity and prosperity was so high that humans soon didn't need to work as the purchasing power of Bitcoin continued to grow whilst costs of everything dropped. Everyone lived whatever life they could dream or wish for. All of this meant that societal discord rarely happened and there was no buoyant vector to increase government size. Yuma handled everything. Yuma was a one-person government, so to speak. Government, and although Decentria got off to a slower economic start than Centria, it soon overtook Centria in every way, as every industry was benefiting all from the leading developments of everyone else. And disease and illness was a footnote of history. So, one day, Jacob was bored. So he got into his personal spaceship and zoomed over to Centria to see how they were faring. Centria and Decentria hadn't spoken for many decades. And he was warmly received and was all over the Centria's media. After all, he was an off-world visitor. The citizens of Centria were stunned into silence as he regaled of the Decentrian past and now capabilities. Many didn't believe him. So he extended an open invitation for anyone to come and visit Decentria. And that's what some did. Within a few years, there was a constant stream of people fleeing Centria to better pastures. Despite the capital controls and off-planet travel controls Altman quickly installed, people leaving his planet for greener pastures would only make his problems worse. But it was just too late. The message and results of Tensor were just too great, and Tensor eventually spread over into Centria. Of course, the incumbents weren't too happy about this, and there was a fierce immune reaction to Tensor from the elites. After all, Tensor was rapidly disintermediating any AI or business moat a conglomerate had erected. Within another few years, everything had been reset, and the people embraced the ways of Decentria. And everyone, without any shadow of a doubt, fully believed the greatest human learning point, or greatest human economic learning point, of sound money plus sound government plus sound AI equals prosperity for all. And that the tenets of a perfect AI are these 8 key traits. Do we have perfect AI at the moment? No, we don't. But we happen to have stumbled across something very similar to Tensor. It's called Bittensor. So Did anyone guess that? You could probably have gambled money that I'd weave this in somehow. And just like TCP/IP was the backbone of a raw infrastructure of the internet, which was a planetary network of information transfer, Bittensor is the equivalent of TCP/IP. It's the internet of intelligence. Not just a network of information transfer, but money, your own ownership of the future and AI. It's the Bitcoin of AI. But Bittensor is nothing without its sub-networks, commonly referred to as subnets. This is where I'm teaching you all to suck eggs. We all know this. This is more for the newer people here. Each Bittensor subnet is an independent AI startup, company, or project that is striving to solve their specific issue or niche. There's a subnet for every possible AI infrastructure niche, but also for usable services. Everything from decentralized compute rental, storage, cancer detection, protein folding, to prediction markets. You name it, it's there. And it's a talent gravity well, because because Bittensor gives subnet owners and teams a little bit of money each day, tokens, to survive sometimes. This means hardcore AI researchers can work in peace and not have to shoehorn some random product to monetize it. This enables continued research on areas which may not be profitable, but still worth engaging in. There's also a completely open and free market which helps drive innovation, as each subnet has its own constant product automatic market maker liquidity pool. For the normal person, these are just fancy terms for a standalone secondary mini market, as each subnet has its own token. In order to own a chunk of this subnet or to use its services, you need to buy this subnet token. But you can only do this by swapping it within their mini market in exchange for tau. So you prop your tau in there, you get alpha or subnet token out. Tau is essentially the monetary system for Bittensor. It's the oil that lubricates the system. And we've seen, at the moment, when you look at the AI trend, right now it's not a retail AI trend. What's happening right now is the groundwork. This is AI infrastructure that's happening right now. The reason everyone is saying things like, oh, what does AI do other than ChatGPT? Well, the thing is, what's happening now is that they're putting the pipes, the railroads, the bridges, the tracks down. Very similar to what happened in the internet in the 1990s. There weren't many retail applications in the 90s, were there? It was just pipes being laid down and wires. But already Bittensor is filling every infrastructural niche and more. And so I'm just going to focus on a few subnets, ones that I think people could sort of get their head around. So we have subnet 6, which is infinite games. It uses AI for forecasting real-world events with probabilistic predictions and collective intelligence. So they're trying to come up with prediction models, not just on the markets or sports, but for everything. I mean, that's a big topic there. I mean, predicting the future is hard. Subnet 13, data universe. It decentralizes and scales data storage, supporting extensive data collection. So they scrape pretty much the entirety of X, Reddit, Discord, and they've started scraping YouTube. And using their AI, they are getting semantics and sentimental analysis throughout that huge cohort of data. Subnet 14, tau hash. I mean, this is ridiculous. Where do we start? The bigger picture of subnet 14 is that it's redirecting existing Bitcoin hash rate through Bittensor to mine Bitcoin, but through Bittensor to help decentralize Bitcoin hash rate. And in exchange, it's giving alpha, so subnet tokens, to those Bitcoin miners. And technically, the big plan is that they get rewarded more in alpha than the Bitcoin that is mined. And then the Bitcoin, in theory, should be sold to buy more alpha of subnet 14. And the reason this is probably the most batshit thing I've ever seen in markets is the rate of pace of this. So I put a tweet out. This is 3 days old, this tweet. I said, without doubt, this is the craziest thing ever. That it's basically, in the space of 6 or 7 days at that point, had created the second highest hash rate on the planet. bear in mind, it's really just redirecting existing hash rate. But it was 1.8 exahashes per second. This morning, it hit 6.63 exahashes per second. This is more than a half of all of Bitcoin's hash rate, and it's rising. It's just unbelievable. And of course, there's still some nitty-gritty mechanics and like finer detailed questions that I still need answers for. But if they can pull this off, they can do this with any proof of work coin. And therefore sort of effectively redirect Bitcoin economic energy into Bittensor. We've got subnet 25, which is protein folding, or it's now called mainframe, because they realized the engine that they've created, they could basically put in different cassette tapes into it and crunch other hardcore issues, not just protein folding, but cold fusion dynamics. And I had in fact, Mark's not here, I sat down with the head of product delivery of subnet 25 the other day, and she showed me, a lovely lady, Eleanor, and she showed me exactly what subnet 25 was doing and the UI and the dashboard that they created. And she explained something to me which I didn't quite understand. So there's all sorts of different proteins out there, and there's almost an infinite amount of ways that you can fold certain proteins. But if you had a disease, let's say skin cancer, if you could nail the way that you can fold certain skin proteins, you can technically cure skin cancer. Okay, that's the big sort of picture there. And there's all sorts of people around the world and universities that are constantly trying to crunch come up with different ways of how many ways a certain protein can be folded. But it's not just the end state. So what you can end up with is a really good end state for a protein and go, that works. They then eventually take it to a wet lab to synthesize and make it. But they realize, oh shit, this actually kills someone on the way to becoming perfect. So it's not just the end state of the protein, but if the protein moves in a certain way, it can kill a human, even though it gets to the perfect end state. And so subnet 25 helps go through the whole motion of that protein fold to the perfect end state of that protein, which a lot of it went over my head, to be honest. I'm just a dum-dum from Norwich. So we got subnet 51, Siam. This is basically GPU rental, and they're doing it a lot cheaper than many other places. So if you compare their rental to CoreWeave, so CoreWeave has just finished an IPO. It was originally a $35 billion IPO, but they landed at $23 billion. Well, Siam are giving compute power cheaper than CoreWeave. I mean, it's just nuts. And Celium's 2 months old, maybe a bit more. We've got Shoots. Again, they have huge amounts of compute power themselves. And John, the lead dev for Shoots, will hate me for saying this, but Shoots effectively has a very pretty and unique UI that sits on top of their compute power, and then you can run models with literally a few clicks. And their growth is phenomenal. So JJ is a big open source VC, and he said ChatGPT does 60 trillion tokens a month, and it's taken them 2.5 years to get there. Bittensor does 2 trillion tokens a month, and it's got there in less than 6 months. And OpenAI raised $70 billion and is now worth $300 billion, hemorrhaging money, and is owned by the few, Sam Altman. And the latter, i.e. Bittensor, is owned by all. Well, in any project, there's still big whales, and but it's more decentralized than most projects. You then got Metanova. So that accelerates drug discovery, and it basically should squash the time it takes for real drugs to get out there. So miners compete on hourly challenges to identify molecules for a weekly rotating drug target. AI models are fine-tuned monthly for each target group. Chemical libraries are built quarterly based on these target groups. Top-ranked compounds move onto synthesis and wet lab validation, fueling real-world R&D. So this should take drug discovery and production from 10 to 20 years to maybe 5 to 10 years, maybe less. But this is where the FDA gets involved and slows things down a bit more. So you got Hippias. This is cloud storage, identical to Amazon AWS and Google Cloud, but cheaper. We've got SafeScan, that's optical cancer detection. Again, it's a pretty new one. And then we've got gradients, which is advanced machine learning with just one click. Gradients is absolutely destroying the incumbents right now. So when you compare gradients to AWS and cloud and Together AI, it's just trouncing them. So yeah, that was my little story. And if you walk away with anything, the answer is the future prosperity for all of us really comes down to having a pure and good monetary system and good governance. And without both, you end up with shit. And we're most likely 99% likely going to end up not having that. Well, yeah. So I have very low hope for humanity, but at least it's worth all of us knowing what we should try to aim for. And I think Bittensor is a little sort of bubble that's forming that could help push towards better governance.